Why has the United States seemingly has never been successfully invaded in Cuba? Just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, a defiant island stood its ground, small in size, but immense in geopolitical impact. Cuba, under the revolutionary leadership of Fidel Castro, became a symbol of resistance and a flashpoint in the Cold War. Backed by the Soviet Union and fortified with communist ideology, this island nation wasn't just another neighbor. It was an ideological adversary, positioned alarmingly close to the American mainland. Tensions simmered, spies watched, and missiles moved in the shadows. With its unmatched military might and global influence, many expected the United States to strike, hard and fast. Yet despite multiple provocations, the US never launched a full-scale invasion. Why? The answer lies not just in military calculations, but in a web of international politics, nuclear threats, and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. The truth is more complex than most realize, and far more dangerous. From botched invasions and nuclear standoffs to shadowy negotiations and battles for global perception, the story of US-Cuba relations is not just history, it's a Cold War thriller that played out in real time. In this video, we unravel the intense power struggle that kept two ideologically opposed nations on the brink of war, yet narrowly averted disaster. Discover why the world's most powerful superpower held back from fully invading Cuba, and how that restraint may have prevented a nuclear catastrophe that could have changed the course of history forever. In 1961, the United States attempted to bring down Fidel Castro, but the mission failed. In a covert CIA operation, Cuban exiles were trained, armed, and sent to Cuba to overthrow Castro's government. Known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, the plan was meant to be quick, decisive, and deniable. Instead, it became one of the most embarrassing US foreign policy failures. From the start, the mission suffered from poor planning and critical misjudgments. The exiles landed on a remote, swampy beach with no strategic advantage. As they moved inland, they faced strong Cuban resistance. To make matters worse, promised US air support was canceled at the last minute. Within 3 days, the fighters were defeated. Many were killed or captured and later paraded on Cuban television in a show of defiance. For President Kennedy, it was a major political setback, but the consequences went deeper. In Cuba, the failed invasion strengthened Castro's popularity and image as a national hero. Around the world, the US was seen as a superpower targeting a small nation. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just a military failure, it was a PR disaster that made any future invasion far more complex and risky. Just 1 year after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1962, the stakes rose dramatically. The Soviet Union, aiming to protect its Cuban ally and challenge US dominance, began secretly installing nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. These weren't just symbolic, they were capable of striking nearly every major US city within minutes. When American U-2 spy planes captured images confirming the missile sites, the world held its breath. What followed were 13 days of intense fear. For nearly 2 weeks, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war. Military forces mobilized, DEFCON levels rose, and doomsday felt dangerously close. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were locked in a tense standoff, with the fate of the world at stake. Never before, or since, has humanity come so close to global annihilation. This informal agreement, never signed, became a cornerstone of Cold War diplomacy. It diffused the most dangerous crisis of the era and set an unspoken rule. Cuba would remain communist, and the US would avoid direct military action. The world had stood on the edge and barely stepped back in time. But nuclear risk wasn't the only reason for restraint. Invading Cuba wasn't just a military action, it was a political gamble. After the failures in Korea and the beginning of US involvement in Vietnam, the last thing Washington wanted was another endless war, especially one so close to home. Cuba had a fiercely loyal population and guerrilla fighters trained to resist occupation. An invasion could have triggered years of insurgency and bloodshed, right on America's doorstep. There was also the critical matter of international image. Invading Cuba wouldn't have just been a military action, it would have been a global statement. To many, especially across Latin America, it would have reinforced the belief that the United States was an imperialist power, willing to crush smaller nations to protect its interests. Anti-American sentiment was already growing in the region due to decades of political interference, economic control, and covert operations. A full-scale invasion would have poured fuel on the fire, alienating potential allies and destabilizing the US's influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was poised to seize any opportunity to weaponize US actions through global propaganda. An invasion of Cuba would have been a public relations gift to the Kremlin, allowing them to portray the United States not as a defender of democracy, but as the true aggressor in the Cold War. Headlines across the globe would have shifted in tone, and public opinion in Europe, Asia, and the developing world could have turned sharply against the US. America wasn't just fighting a military conflict. It was fighting a battle for ideology, for moral high ground, and for the hearts and minds of people around the world. In that high-stakes contest, perception was everything. And to US leaders, especially in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs failure, Cuba simply wasn't worth sacrificing the country's global image or risking a wider, possibly nuclear war. Instead of invading again, the US turned to covert tactics. The CIA launched Operation Mongoose, a secret campaign to destabilize Castro's regime through sabotage, psychological warfare, and assassination attempts. Some plots bordered on the absurd: exploding cigars, poison diving suits, even LSD-laced sprays to make Castro act bizarre in public. It sounded like spy fiction, but many of these plans were real. Behind the scenes, this shadow war reflected just how desperate the US was to remove Castro. His alliance with the Soviet Union wasn't just a political problem, it was a Cold War threat sitting right off the American coast. Yet every covert mission that failed only seemed to strengthen his grip on power. Yet Castro survived them all, famously joking he must be the most targeted man on Earth. Despite decades of pressure, Cuba remained defiant, isolated, yes, but never conquered. In the end, the United States didn't hold back because it lacked the firepower or the will to fight, but because the true cost of victory would have been devastating. A full-scale invasion could have triggered a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, unleashed years of bloody insurgency on Cuban soil, and provoked global outrage that would haunt America's image for decades. The price of winning wasn't just high, it was unthinkable. History teaches us that strength isn't always shown through action. Sometimes the most powerful and courageous decision is to not pull the trigger, to step back from the edge, to choose diplomacy over destruction. But what do you think? Should the US have invaded Cuba when the opportunity was there? Could it have changed the course of history for the better, or would it have sparked something far worse? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take. And if you're fascinated by hidden chapters and dark twists in history, don't miss our next video on the secret Cold War bunker buried beneath a luxury resort. What it was built for will shock you, and it was never meant to be discovered.